Gonzaga Socratic Club. If you haven't been before, the Socratic Club is an organization that's existed for a little bit over 15 years here at Gonzaga now. We take our name and inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club, which functioned in the mid-1900s under the presidential leadership of Christian apologist and author C.S. Lewis. And we also follow the motto of the Socratic Club in Oxford was to follow the argument wherever it leads. And we do that too by philosophically investigating Christian worldview issues. So we discuss topics like the problem of evil, the nature of God, Christianity and popular culture, and so forth. We have not quite 15 years worth, but a number of years worth of videos and recordings on the Gonzaga Socratic Club website. So if you're interested, take a look. If you do want to stay in touch and hear about events, as I said, there's a sign-up list. Please do sign up for that. We meet once a month during the academic year, and we try to find a range of interesting topics and speakers, and we definitely have that in our meetings today. Dr. Dan Bradley has a long interest in Tolkien. He's regaled me with tales of being an undergraduate and organizing reading groups of Lord of the Rings with friends, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. He also teaches a first-year seminar on Tolkien and language. If you're a Tolkien fan, you know that Tolkien not only wrote stories, but he created an entire mythical world that included a set of languages. And that's one thing that Dr. Bradley finds very interesting. But today, he's going to talk about Poesis and the Imago Dei, making or creating in the image of God and how they're related in Tolkien's thought. So if you would, please welcome Dr. Dan Bradley.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming in. I think it's one of the most beautiful days of the year. You must have been tempted to just walk right past the building down to the river, but I'm glad you're here. I hope it made it worthwhile. The pressure's kind of up a notch when the weather's so beautiful. If it was pouring down rain out there, I would feel like I wasn't in risk of wasting your time. I do love Lord of the Rings. It's been really an important part of my life. My dad read The Hobbit to me when I was 11, and then I read this series myself. And then when I was at university, I did get a group of very strange people together to read out loud the Lord of the Rings. It should be heard as an oral tradition. My rugby friends thought I was a complete lunatic, but of course these friends also thought I was a lunatic for playing rugby. So there we go. I'm not going to talk much about Lord of the Rings at all. I'm going to talk about Tolkien's more theoretical work, and particularly this essay on fairy stories. If I can do anything, it would be to convince you to read this essay. I've got an abbreviated version. The original one is a little long and complicated. If you're interested, Bradley D at gonzaga.edu, or you can find me on the philosophy website, and I'll send you a PDF. My topic is the implication for a philosophical and theological anthropology of this theological claim of the Imago Dei. It's really quite a striking claim that there is a being, the human being, that is the very image of God, the image of the divine. Sometimes we think of humanism as aligned with agnosticism or even atheism, but there's really no more elevated conception of the human being, no more grandiose claim for human dignity than that we are the image of God. I want to think through with you today what that means and Tolkien's vision of what that could be. We usually think of the image of God as referring to our capacity for reason, that we're like God, and we can talk about the difference between the image and the likeness of God if we have time. But we're like God in our capacity to use reason to understand the world. That's going to be important for Tolkien, but much more important for him, we're like God in our ability to create. So he understands God fundamentally as creator and human beings as participating in the divine nature through our acts of creation and acts of creativity. This is interesting. I have a mixed audience, but I know some of you are extremely well-versed in theology, and I would make the claim, unsubstantiated and undefended, that the doctrine of creation has been underappreciated in our philosophical appropriations of Christianity. We tend to think about Christianity as talking about salvation, and I think we've underemphasized the notion of creation. And we have all of that at work here. So today I'm going to talk about creation. I'm going to walk pretty carefully through this essay on fairy stories. Tolkien tells us he's going to investigate what is a fairy story. And the first thing you do, as you were trained in high school when you want to understand something, is to go to the dictionary, right? Well, you don't just go to any dictionary, you go to the Oxford English Dictionary. And there's quite a mystique about this, about the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. Tolkien himself worked on it when he was at Oxford, when he was a young man. And later in his life, when he was writing his fiction, there's the OED. One of his editors complained about some grammatical construction, and he wrote a short letter back saying, I wrote the Oxford English Dictionary. What the hell are you talking about? Don't criticize my use of grammar. I actually have a deep personal connection to the OED as well. When I was an undergraduate, before I was an academic at all, I wasn't really intellectual in my 20s as much as I wish I had been. I was a fisherman in Alaska, and I used to fish on commercial boats with my brothers. And we loved language. We loved words. We'd have fights about words. We'd wonder where a word came from. And that's one of the great things about the OED, is it gives us etymologies. Not just the meanings of words. It's the most complete account of where words come from. And there's a great poetry to etymologies. I think that we can understand a lot about our world through those. Martin Heidegger is a great example of a contemporary philosopher who makes a lot of etymologies. But if you really want the best source that I've come across, it would be Barfield, Poetic Diction. I think he's a weird dude. He was friends with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. But I think this book, Poetic Diction, gives a pretty good account of why we should care about the history of language, the history of words. If you take my Tolkien class, we do some of that philosophy of language. Anyway, we get off the boats, and then go up to the Juneau or the Sitka Library. It was kind of a pilgrimage to go pull out this copy of the OED and consult it. And so we built up kind of a special relation to this dictionary. In fact, my brother almost bought it one time. It was $2,000 at the time. This is in the late 90s. We were making great money fishing, so that wasn't really the problem. The problem is, you can see it takes up, it's like 20 volumes, takes up a bookcase. So in the end, we decided not to own our own copy. But now every Gonzaga student has free access to the OED online. So if you just use any Gonzaga computer, you can get the OED. Now, as much as I've told you how wonderful this dictionary is, how much I love it, and how much Tolkien loves it, in this case, it fails us. Because when Tolkien went to the OED to look up fairy story, he found no entry at all. There was no entry for fairy story. Now, there's an entry for fairy tale, and for myth, and for folk tale, but Tolkien is extremely hung up about language. Language shapes the way we see the world, and we should use care in our use of language. And he doesn't write about too much about this in this essay, but there are a lot of resonances with this language of myth and of folktale that he's going to find problematic, right? And he does talk about the fact that fairy tales have been relegated to the nursery. We consider them only suitable for children, right? Well, myth has similar connotations, but for the childhood of humanity, myths are fine for primitive people, savages, until they get a proper scientific account. And so we associate myth and folktale with childishness, with backward primitive natures, and with untruths. And he thinks these are all very problematic. So he goes to fairy, and he says that there is going to be a definition for fairy in the OED. But unfortunately, they tell us fairies are supernatural beings of diminutive size. And Tolkien takes great issue with this definition. The fact that they're diminutive, they have shrunk down, they become so dainty they can hide behind a little glacier lily or a blade of grass, and that they're supernatural. Tolkien wants to tell us, actually, if anything's supernatural here, it's human beings. Fairies are a depiction of the natural world, of nature in its natural state. Now, I was wondering if we still have this view about fairies. I think we do, but I did a quick Google search, which is a nice way to understand your culture. And what did I find? Well, yes. Here's a nice romantic depiction of these little diminutive fairies, little points of light, right? What else do you think I found? Well, of course, Tinkerbell, tiny little beings, but here we see both. The fairy's been relegated to childhood. I don't know why that went so far. There was also a category that Tolkien wouldn't have recognized, or perhaps maybe this is tied to our computer culture, super eroticized notions of the fairy. We're going to come back to that, a kind of hypersexualized view. But something I was thinking of that Tolkien doesn't talk about is angels. Something similar has happened to angels as has happened to fairies. So what do you think of when you think of an angel? Well, we just had Valentine's Day, right? The little Michelangelo cherubs. They're very cute. They've been infantilized. They've been made weak. They've been made overly kind of innocent and childlike. And are these religious? Are these still religious angels? Where there's a big debate about that, whether the Renaissance art is still religious art or not. I tend to fall on the side that this is a religious depiction, but it's a certain kind of version of a sort of humanistic account. But even the more explicitly religious depictions of angels, like this, look, our angels have become very effete, very, very weak, very sort of ethereal even, right? Is this how angels have been depicted deep in the tradition? No, think about it in the New Testament. What does the angel say every time it shows up? Don't be afraid. Why does it have to say that? Because everybody's scared shitless when they appear, right? There's something terrifying about the angel. Nothing like the kinds of depictions that we get of the angel in our contemporary world. Their angels are being taken seriously a little bit in contemporary culture again in high art. Here's Simberg, one of the kind of great Finnish modernist painters. But notice the angel has become childlike, again, sort of weakened, an image of vulnerability, an image of weakness, and strangely, naturalized. So our fairies have been supernaturalized, and our angels have been naturalized. I think that should be a backwards account. I follow Tolkien here to say, fairies are supposed to tell us something about nature, about our natural world, and angels are supposed to be depicting something about the supernatural. Anyway, this was how we would see angels in a more traditional context. So what's been going on here? What are these symptomatic, how is this symptomatic of a loss in our culture? Well, in order to understand that, he gives us a criticism both of magic and of drama as the dominant way of understanding art. So first I want to give his critique of magic. We need a word for this elvish craft. So what are we talking about? We're talking about fairy stories. For Tolkien, this is creative endeavors. Human beings telling stories, bringing something new into being, right? So that's what we're after. That's what we're trying to get at. And we're saying that we don't have the proper resources for thinking about that act of creativity. He says we need a word for this elvish craft, but all the words that have been applied to it have been blurred and confused with other things. Magic is ready to hand, and I have used it above. So before he says, telling a fairy story is like a magic spell, but I should not have used that word. Magic should be reserved for the operations of the magician. Magic produces or pretends to produce an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal. It remains distinct from the other two. It is not an art, but a technique. Magic. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. So hear the language here, domination, power, technique, right? The creative desire of making things, on the other hand, is distinct from this notion of magic. It's only cheated by counterfeits, whether the innocent but clumsy devices of the human dramatist or the malevolent frauds of the magicians. So he links drama and magic. In this world, it is for human beings unsatisfiable and so imperishable. Uncorrupted, this desire to create does not seek delusion nor bewitchment and domination. It seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves. So whatever making we're talking about, it's that kind of a relationship that builds relationship rather than controls and dominates. I wanted you to hear it, not read it. So I decided not to show you this slide, but if you need it afterwards, I can show you this. The citation is page 8 on fairy stories. I will show you this one from C.S. Lewis. I think he puts it even more succinctly. I'm sure many of you know this quote. It's a very famous one. There is something which unites magic and applied science. So Tolkien's criticism here, we misunderstand fairies because we misunderstand nature. And we misunderstand nature because we understand it in terms of science and technology. There's something which unites magic and applied science while separating them from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise people of old, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform the soul to objective reality. And the solution was wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue. For the modern human, on the other hand, the cardinal problem is how to conform reality to the wishes of the human. And the solution is technique. Right? So the direction of the relation has been overturned. That's his criticism of magic and its relation to science and technology. Now to his relation. So what's wrong with that? Well, I think we have a sense of this. I'm just going to evoke and hand wave at this. It's an instrumental view. Everything in the natural world becomes something to be used, to be consumed for our purposes, right? Meaning is not supposed to come from, this is also related to the fact-value distinction, right? Science just tells us facts. which allow us to predict and therefore to manipulate and control the natural world. So where is meaning supposed to come from? I have personal experience of this. I was a biology major here at Gonzaga in the 90s, and the first day of class, all my biology and professors would say, this class only asks how questions. We don't ask why questions, right? There is no meaning in nature. And I'd raise my hand and say, but I want meaning. And they'd say, all right, Bradley, if you want to do something like find meaning, go do something sissy like philosophy. I'm like, all right, maybe I should, so I went over to philosophy. But this is the bifurcation that Tolkien finds problematic. Science gives us facts. Meaning and value is supposed to come from the humanities. And in particular, Tolkien thinks from drama. Now listen to this quote. For this, I'll give you something better to look at. For this reason, that the characters and even the scenes are in drama. What's different between drama, theater, stage, versus a creative fantasy, storytelling? In drama, the scenes are not imagined, but actually beheld. Drama is, even though it uses similar material, words, verse, plot, and art, fundamentally different from narrative art. Thus, if you prefer drama to literature, as many literary critics plainly do, or form your critical theories primarily from dramatic critics, or even from drama, you are apt to misunderstand pure story making and to constrain it to the limitations of stage plays. You are, for instance, likely to prefer characters, even the basest and dullest, to things. Very little about trees can be got into a play, right? I just love this line. And of course, this is what the Kantians are going to tell you. Meaning doesn't come from the river or from the tree. It comes from human beings. And this is what drama does. Drama is fundamentally about human relationships. I mean, I love watching Les Mis and Phantom of the Opera and so on, but I think the sort of the epitome of drama is Beckett. I don't know if you've seen Waiting for Godot, like a blank stage, two people talking. Drama is about human beings and human relationships. This is the modernist account. Meaning comes from human beings, and humans are the only source of intrinsic value. So what's wrong with this position? Well, it's anthropocentrism, right? This is the suggestion that humans are the only source of meaning, and it leads us to mistreat the natural world. I think certainly in my mind, there's no doubt about this. Climate change, human beings, and our relation to nature has led to catastrophic destruction of the beauty and goodness of the natural world. We can think about battery hens. I think this is something that our grandchildren are going to look back on us with horror about the way we treat chickens and cattle. So there's a moral element here about this anthropocentrism, this view that nature is merely mechanistic to be controlled, an instrumental view, leads us to mistreat things. But even more fundamentally for people like Tolkien and the people I read, this leads to a problem for ourselves, right? This destroys our own lives, and we're going to use the language of alienation, right? That this leads us into an alienated human existence. So just briefly, I want to take us through a little theory of alienation. As I was thinking about this, we just were talking about last Socratic Club. Our question is Marxian communism compatible with Christianity? Marx is, of course, the most famous theorist of alienation. So I would just want to appeal to him just very briefly for thinking. So the question here is, what's wrong with anthropocentrism? And the answer is it alienates human beings. It leads us to a empty, lonely, disconnected life. Now, Marx was an atheist, but he comes from a long line of very pious Jewish forefathers. His father was a rabbi, and his grandfather before him. So what is the great story that comes out of the Hebraic tradition about this notion of alienation, human beings being cut off? Of course, it's the Garden of Eden, right? And this, I think, is going to help us make sense of what Tolkien thinks goes wrong in modern philosophy. So just think to yourselves for a second about this. What is it that human beings, the opposite of alienation, of course, is intimacy. So what's at stake here is where the source of meaning in my life is to come from. The modernist account is that it's to come from me as an act of self-creation. And the world that Tolkien wants to say is the meaning comes from being in intimate relations with others. I find myself a part of a world of pre-existing meaning. So what are some of the key depictions of alienation in the Garden of Eden? Maybe I could get some of it. Maybe some of you have some ideas. What is the loss of intimate relation? What are some of the losses of intimate relationships that occur in being tossed out of the Garden of Eden. No, alienation means being cut off, right? Any suggestions? Luke, do you have any ideas for me? Tell us a little bit about that. This ties in nicely with Tolkien, doesn't it, right? It's in the act of creation that we participate in the divine nature. Well, the ultimate act of creation is creating a new child, bringing a new child into being. And now what do we say after being tossed out of the Garden of Eden? That most intimate and beautiful of acts now is going to be associated with pain and suffering, right? And therefore with anxiety. Other things, other ideas?
Well, suddenly Adam and Eve become aware of like their nakedness and feel like a need to wear clothes.
And so how does that depict what was once a primordial intimacy now being torn apart, alienated?
That it kind of like skews it, makes it seem shameful sort of, being naked, I guess.
It does, and that does two things, right? An intimate relationship to my own body. To have to clothe my body, now I think of my own naturalness, my own fleshliness as something that needs to be hidden, right? But it also marks an alienation between human beings. So we have an alienation between human beings and nature and our own natural existence, but also between each other. Nakedness is the ultimate sign of trust, right? To not have to wear clothes means the other would never view you as something to be consumed for their own sexual titillation or pleasure, right? To wear clothes is a marker of our alienation from each other. I don't want to talk too much about Lord of the Rings, but remember when the hobbits come out of the barrel? They run naked in the grass, right? And we always see arrows everywhere, but for Tolkien, this is a totally non-sexualized nakedness, I think is depicting that kind of original intimacy between human beings. Other ideas?
There's a disconnection between animals and farmland.
Sure.
You will till the ground and it will give you thistles and wheat.
Very good.
And also the animals no longer respond to Adam as master as readily.
Yeah.
He previously would name them and walk among them.
Sure. And they listen to Adam and Eve, right? So I don't know how much this is in the Hebrew scriptures and how much is in the medieval stories that build up around it. But the legend is that humans never killed or ate animals. The animals listened to the humans. They were subservient to humans, but humans did everything for the good, for the animals' good, cared for them, looked after them, protected them. Right? A relation of intimacy with animals is part of this alienation from nature. Tolkien tells us it's not a coincidence that in all the fairy tales the animals can talk. Why? This is a listening, a deep, deep hunger for us to know and relate to animals, to animal existence. Can you think of other ones?
The initial blaming by Adam of Eve for like pushing into temptation.
Yeah. Isn't there's an ultimate alienation between the two, between the couple? Adam's not there, by the way, when Eve gets tempted. There's something strange about that, right? After lying together, they're separated. So we see all these things. Nature is depicted as a paradise. It's a home, right? It produces everything we need. Our labor, not only childbirth, but also procuring food and shelter. It's always depicted as a place that's warm and tropical, luscious with food and things to eat, right? An image of ultimate at-homeness in nature, being at home in the world.
Right? So you're alienated from God as well.
And alienated from God.
The one you put here,
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
totally isolated.
Sure. And the two are related, isn't it? The alienation between the husband and the wife and the alienation between God, right? So here we have, I think this is helping us make sense of what Tolkien's after here. It's a depiction of alienation. So the ultimate problem with an instrumental view of nature is being lost, being lonely, being cut off. Our labor becomes alienated, our relationship to the natural world, and we become alone. Right? So creation is a way of overcoming that alienation. Now there's different theories that we could talk about theories of alienation from the world, from our labor, from our human nature even, says Marx, and also alienation from God. Different theories about what causes this alienation. Ultimately, original sin is going to be on the horizon here for Tolkien. We'll come back to that at the end of my talk. But he shares a lot of similar critiques that we're going to find in Marx. That we could talk about. The economic system is alienating. Now, for Marx, that's a critique of capitalism. For Tolkien, it's a critique of capitalism and communism, which he finds even more alienating than capitalism. So if any of you are interested, you can Google distributivism. I'm not talking about political economy, but Marx, along with people like Chesterton, were looking for a third way, an alternative between capitalism and communism. Alienations that occur through the process of industrialization, imperialism. But the one I want to turn to immediately is possessiveness. And this is related to the notion of original sin, and it's related to an instrumental notion of nature. We become alienated from the natural world as seeing it as something to possess, something thereby to consume, right? And Tolkien tells us that the act of creation should help us overcome that situation of alienation. So let me read you a little more from On Fairy Stories. The world becomes trite too. I don't know if you, how many people are familiar with this essay on fairy stories? A few of you, right? You'll remember this. He quotes Chesterton, the Maury Fock effect. The world becomes overly familiar and we need something to help us see it in a new way to wake us back up. We don't have Maury Fox, but we do have Lurg and ducks. Have you ever seen a Lurg and duck before? Oh no, that's not. Yeah, well, it's pub and grill on the glass door, seen backwards, right? What was it once seemed strange and mysterious is helping us to wake us back up to the ordinary and the everyday. Chesterton loves this kind of thing. I don't know if you remember the story where the man takes off in his sailboat to explore and find some wonderful new world, and he gets into a big storm out at sea, and he finally, after weeks, gets washed ashore, and he comes up and he sees all these strange beings and their amazing exotic customs, and then he realizes he's like in Derbyshire or some little English village, 10 kilometers from where he took off, right? But Tolkien thinks, well, that's all important here. It's really this notion of possessiveness that's the key here. And if you know Tolkien's fiction, you'll know that it's often the characters grow by learning to let go. Right? I think this is really familiar in Tolkien scholarship. Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey as kind of archetypal world mythology. You've probably heard something about this, right? The hero is called away from his or her little village context, given a quest, called to accomplish a task, usually to go get something, to go get the Holy Grail, gets help along the way, achieves the task, finds the sacred object, and brings it back home, right? Well, what is Frodo's job? It's the inversion of the hero's quest, right? It's to get rid of the ring, to learn to let go. And he's not able to do it, so he loses a finger in the process, right? Beren loses a hand, learning to let go. All right. So creative fantasy, this act of creation using words, because it's mainly trying to do something else. It's more than just the Maury Fock effect or the Lurgan duck effect. What is it trying to do? It's trying to make something new. And in doing so, it may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems all turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all that you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, but free and wild, no more yours than they were you. So in telling stories about things, it learns to see them not as a possession to be consumed, but rather as just the opposite, as a potent, dangerous force. So Tolkien opens the essay by talking about the realm of fairy as the perilous realm, right? And this notion of danger opens up a relation of respect and responsiveness. And that's why I think, just briefly, I want to go back to this idea of that kind of titillating image of Eros that we saw at the beginning, the fantasy fairy that's there just to conform to my desire. Well, if we go back, Tolkien doesn't talk about Eros very much, but if you look back at the tradition, the fairies are often deeply erotic. But they're erotic not in the way like I showed you that first picture, right? Look at these fairies. Of course, you know this story, right? These are the sirens from the Iliad. They're extremely dangerous, they're destructive. So both beautiful and seductive, but also very, very dangerous, something to be treated with the utmost respect. In fact, only the wily Odysseus can hear their song because he's so clever, right? We see lots of cases. In that case, the fairy is a female, but you can see here is Boreas, the god of the north wind, carrying away Orathuia, right? Kind of violent act of abduction, erotic, but also violent and dangerous. The reason I know about this is because this is in the Phaedrus, where Socrates and Phaedrus sit down on the banks of the river. They say, wasn't this where Orathuia was carried away? Right? Not a coincidence. What do we have? We have a notion here of Eros is something that's not under my control, right? But it's rather a madness that I respond, that unchosen passion, a desire that's elicited in me that I can't control, right? Something to which I respond. And that's everything that Tolkien's trying to establish here, is a relationship with nature. This is Zeus coming clothed as a swan to seduce Leda. We can see lots of these. This is a more modern depiction of the fairy queen from Spenser. There's a tradition in Ireland about the Gonzaga. These are male fairies that exist in the woods, and they seduce women who come out into the woods for whatever reason. Okay, so that's what he wants ultimately, is relationship, responsiveness, to find a world that's no longer transparent to our will, but stands up as something to which we can creatively respond, something you can have a relationship with, a courtship with. But I don't think Eros is the best way of thinking about Tolkien, because that really is a relation of equality between two partners. That is at the core of Eros. And for Tolkien, he talks about a relation of care, much more like Adam and Eve's relation to the animals, right? It's through the act of creation that I have a nurturing relationship with what I create. So let me continue on. The fantastic elements, but we've established one thing already, which is the desire for relation, a relation to a world that provides meaning to which I can respond. The fantastic elements in verse and prose of other kinds, even when only decorative or occasional, help in this release, but not so thoroughly as a fairy story. A thing built on or about fantasy, of which fantasy is the core. Why? Well, here's the key to the whole talk. Fantasy is made. Lord of the Rings is something that was created, but it's made out of the primary world. Right? So what is the primary materials out of which a storyteller tells is our reality. And then they create a secondary world out of that world. But a good craftsman loves his or her material and has a knowledge and a feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. So it's through the act of making that you come to know and love the materials out of which you're working. Right? And this is the distinction that Tolkien makes between creating and science. I'm glad Dr. Lefcourt came in. We can ask him if he thinks this is the case in the end. But most modern scientists want to tell us science gives us truth, but it doesn't give us value. Science teaches us to know the world. But Tolkien thinks it's creating that teaches us to know and love the world. It reveals the world not only in its truth, but also in its goodness. Right? By the forging of Gram, now Gram is a fairy story sword, comes from the old Anglo-Saxon chronicles. By the forging of Gram, so Gram was made. It was forged. It wasn't forged on a hammer and anvil. It was forged with words. But through this act of making, by the forging of Gram, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stalk, flower and fruit are manifested in glory. Right. So the horse is the primary material out of which the storyteller tells the story of Pegasus. But through the making of Pegasus, horses become ennobled. I come to know and love the horse through the telling of the story. And I do think there's something really to this. I used to think that it was enough to help teach people the beauty of the natural world to take them camping. But I started taking some of my friends camping sometimes, and it would rain, and they would say, "This is miserable. I hate nature," right? So it's not enough just to give people an encounter with the horse. I think there is something about this act of storytelling that helps us to see the material in a particular way, right? To see it as beautiful and good. And actually, fairy stories deal largely, or the better ones mainly, with simple or fundamental things untouched by fantasy. I do think this is I don't want to pick a fight, but I do think Tolkien is much better than Harry Potter. Why? Harry Potter has much more magic, what is Tolkien's, if you read Lord of the Rings, there's very little fireworks, very little sort of magic in play. The great example that comes from The Hobbit is when the hobbits the Hobbit and the dwarves immediately get in trouble with the ogres, remember this, with the trolls. And when Gandalf shows up in the nick of time, he doesn't drop a firebomb on them and destroy them. He tricks them with his voice until the sun comes up, right? So the best fairy stories are about simple things, untouched by fantasy. But these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. So there's magic here, but what happens with the magic It's not that I make the world conform to my desires. I rather see the world in a new way. I see it as luminous, as radiant with goodness. For the story maker who allows him or herself to be free with nature can be her lover, not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words and the wonder of things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. So here we go. I think we have a sense of what he's talking here. It's a very simple idea, right? We have these kind of tropes about the potter and the clay, I think, in our culture. It's through the act of making a pot that something which would ordinarily have been completely missed, the mud and the earth, now becomes something to pay attention to. And I learned as a potter, I now know about all the different kinds of clay, where I'm going to find the right kind of mud that I'm going to use to make my pot. So I come to know the world, but I'm not only to know it, but also to love it and appreciate it, right? So the mud itself becomes now luminous through the act of creating, through the act of creativity. All right, so that is a completely naturalistic account, right? It has had nothing to do with the Imago Dei whatsoever up until this point. So I want to spend the rest of my time. You want to check the time for me, David? Or Rick? Okay, thank you. Now, so we have a very, very positive depiction of humanity, right? That human beings are creators. Through this act of creation, we come to know and love the world and thereby participate in the creative activity of the creator. Very positive. In fact, some critics say way too positive, right? One of my students, a brilliant comment, said, what's the difference between Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings? Well, in Game of Thrones, the eagles ain't coming, right? The fairy stories, according to Tolkien, is supposed to end happy, right? And he calls this Eucatastrophe. Now, some critics have said this is just naive, so I want to now ask, what is the difference between Deus Ex Machina and Eucatastrophe? You remember this term of abuse from literary criticism in high school? What is a Deus Ex Machina ending? Anybody remember? God out of the machine.
It refers to the practice of Greek plays where they would have an actor playing a god lowered onto the stage via crane to solve whatever problem is at hand.
Right. So all storytelling is about a problem, right? Remember your Maytags, there's rising action, crisis, resolution, and denouement, right? And a Deus Ex Machina is saying the resolution to the story doesn't come from within the story itself, right? The author is a bad storyteller, couldn't find any other solution than to drop some god in off of a crane, right? Literally to solve the problem. And that's bad storytelling, and of course it is. It means you don't have enough handle of your own art in order to come up with the resolution from within the resources of the story itself. So, but what is a Eucatastrophe? This is Tolkien's neologism, and this is an unexpected good ending to a story. It's unexpected because there's no way within the resources of the story itself to expect a good ending. Well, it sounds just like Deus Ex Machina, right? Except for Tolkien, this comes out of a long, critical, reflective thought on human existence. And so now we have to turn, in the last 20 minutes, just to a little bit of theology. And we can return to the Garden of Eden. I don't know how much I want to do about this. We have to understand, at least briefly, some of the tragic darkness that exists in Tolkien, right? And Tolkien recognizes human limitation really very, very powerfully. And what I would say here is the way to think about this is he's trying to thread his way between Gnosticism and Pelagianism. And we could talk for a semester about each of these terms. But Gnosticism is very roughly, or Gnostic dualism, is the idea that the solution to the problem of evil can't... Let me reformulate it. You know this, right? That Bertrand Russell said the problem of evil is the rock on which the ship of theism sinks. Because you can't have a God who is all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, and little 2-year-olds getting leukemia and slowly, painfully dying, right? Because if God was all-knowing, he would know what was happening. If he was all good, he wouldn't want it to happen. If he was all-powerful, he would be able to stop it, but he doesn't do it, right? So the Gnostic dualist answers the problem of evil in the world by saying God is not the source of all things. There are two principles at work in the world, the principle of light and goodness and the principle of darkness, and they're locked in a cosmic struggle. Right? And if you have a problem with 2-year-olds getting leukemia, get off your tail and enter into this great fight between the two principles. Right? In Manichaeism, This is Ahura Mazda, the god of light and goodness, and Ahriman, the god of the lie, right? And they're locked in this battle. But there's a high price to pay for this solution to the problem of evil, right? And we could talk. We could say lots of things about it. But the Hebrew Scriptures is designed specifically to defend the goodness of nature, right? God created this and saw that it was good. In case you didn't get the point, it's repeated over and over and over again, right? To take account of the fact that evil isn't or co-original with the world. The world is fundamentally good, right? And yet, on the other hand, Tolkien wants to recognize our own failures and limitations. So the other opposite problem about the source of evil is what we call Pelagianism in Christianity. And this is the idea that if I had just tried hard enough, I could have been perfect, right? That evil is something that I copy rather than something that I'm born into. Right? And so each person falls with the same fall that Adam originally and Eve originally fell with. But Tolkien wants to tell us this isn't true to human experience. There's a kind of tragic darkness and futility that marks our human life. So counterpoised with Tolkien's great glorious account of human creativity is his recognition of our inevitable failure. To get a good sense of this, you should read The Monsters and His Critics. This is Beowulf. This is Tolkien's essay on Beowulf. And there we get a depiction of the necessity of failure. Tolkien's critics say this is a savage, primitive poem. Beowulf fighting a dragon. It should have been fighting another human being. Right? These are the drama critics saying real art is about human relationships. And Tolkien says, no, it's precisely the fact that it's a monster that makes the story so powerful. It's a meditation on our own finitude, our own lack in our own abilities. The other good place to go for thinking about this with Tolkien is Leaf by Niggle. I don't know if a few of you have read this short story. Here we have a creator, a great artist, Niggle, who is a little bit lazy, a little bit mediocre in his creative ability, and torn by his moral obligations, and ultimately ends up failing in his ability to create according to the kind of desires that he has. Right? This certainly seems compatible with my own experience. There's a disconnect between my desire and my ability. Right? And so Leaf by Niggle, Tolkien's reflection on the critique of Pelagianism, his reflection on the Germanic pessimism, all points to a kind of gentleness with our own failures, right? A recognition of our own inability. And so his language of Eucatastrophe is the very considered hope that grace will be the possibility of help coming unlooked for, help that comes beyond what I could have predicted from within my own capacities, right? And from within the capacities that I can imagine within my society. Hope for radical transformation in my own life and the life of the society in which I exist. It's not merely a deus ex machina, thoughtless ending to resolution. It's a hope in the face of the tragic pessimism of reality that unexpected and unlooked for, my own natural desires to create will be fulfilled in ways that are unanticipated and unexpected. Okay, that gives us a few things to think about. In fact, that gives us lots of things to think about. So I'm going to leave lots of time to discuss. I think we have the picture of the human as the creator, but Tolkien theologically understands this as a sub-creator. So maybe there's a distinction that I can leave you with as well. For Tolkien, only God is a creator in the proper sense, because God creates ex nihilo. God creates out of nothing, whereas every human creates from pre-existing stuff. And that's particularly what makes it so valuable for humans, is that through the act of creating, we come to know and love and respond to something outside of us, whereas when God creates out of God's self. There's no alterity. There's nothing other, right? There's nothing other than God out of the act of creation. So creation for humans is fundamentally relational because of our finite, creaturely nature in a way that it's not for God. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions, comments.
Yeah, so in the beginning of the Silmarillion, it seems like Tolkien takes a lot of time to describe creation.
He does. Yeah.
And so kind of the way he describes it there is God is essentially singing a song, like he's creating music. And with within that, his like sub-creations are allowed to kind of create their own song that harmonizes with God. So do you think that's kind of what he's talking about, is how they can create too, but it's in accordance with the larger kind of context that God has made, and then as soon as one of them tries to make their own thing, this disharmonized Melkor basically like causes discord from that.
Yeah, I mean, so this is great. If you haven't had a chance to read the Silmarillion, this might inspire you to do it. It's much harder reading than Lord of the Rings, which are fairy stories. The Silmarillion is not a fairy story. It's more like a cosmology, right? But there he's trying to dance his way between Gnosticism and Pelagianism. He wants to suggest that we find ourselves already in a broken world, right? Melkor is corrupt. And yet he wants to say that evil was not co-equal with the creation, right? And that it came into being only through choice, through a turning away. But there again, it's related to the capacity of creatures to also be creators, right? So think about Fëanor with the Silmarils. Tolkien wants to say that you have to come to know and love your material, but you also have to let it go. The product of your creation. The desire to keep and control your creation leads to a kind of possessiveness, which is fundamentally at odds with our reality as sub-creators. Right? The world is not our creation. We're only participants in the ongoing act of divine creation. And to think that this language of original sin is tied to the sin of pride, right? Trying to be equal with God. That's often understood in a moral context. Here it's understood in a context of creation, right? I don't know, there's a few thoughts about that. Other ideas? Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning that Tolkien was nice in oral tradition and thought Tolkien and some other traditions were doing it.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that? Why you should read Tolkien instead of listening to an audiobook on it? Any basis for if Tolkien had any opinions on it, should be read aloud?
How many of you, the first time you read Lord of the Rings, skipped all the songs? Right? Because they're boring. We're trained to read for plot, right? To try and understand what the storyline is, what the crisis is, what is going to be the resolution of the story. And an oral tradition, it doesn't have that kind of expectation of reaching the end, right? So there's a kind of training in being present. I've heard that African masses, and not in Nairobi, but in the rural parts of Africa, if you say an hour and a half mass, the parishioners all get upset with you because they expect an all-day affair. It's just being there, just participating and being a part of the sound of the poetry, right? And so I think reading a poem isn't going to cut it, right? Poetry needs to be heard, to be read slowly, to sit with the sound, all the oral meaning, the rhythm, and I think that only can come from out loud. And there's lots that can be said about that. This is one of my areas of interest. And Walter Ong wrote a great book called Orality and Literacy, where he talks about the difference between an oral people and a literate people. Our orientation towards truth really changes. Now, I've taught this before, and the first semester students came away saying Ong hates literacy and thinks we shouldn't write. Of course, we tend to think in such either-or categories, right? But of course he wants us to both. But what he's saying is that we live in a world in which literacy is imperialistic. It's taken over every aspect of our life. And so we need to be really self-conscious about carving out an area of our life where orality is going to reign, right? I love that line from Good Will Hunting where, what's his name, Matt Damon says to the yuppie from Harvard, I could have got your education for $1.50 in late fines at the public library. Right? It's a great scene. It's kind of it's kind of egalitarian and so on, but it's not true. Because education is not just reading books. It's also talking about ideas. And we just have to be really proactive about maintaining an oral part of your life. And I think Tolkien is really good at that. I mean, when I was really excited about Tolkien, I went back and read Beowulf, and I just didn't find it very interesting. But I think what Tolkien can do is he can sort of make that orality accessible for a literate consciousness. If you're able to train yourself and take the time and if you can find people to read it out loud with, I think that helps to do that.
I think not just in his songs and poems, but even like his descriptions of landscape and stuff like that. Reading aloud, you pick up on rhythm and alliteration and just his mastery of language
Yeah.
that you don't necessarily get when you read silently in your head.
Sure. I mean, we can talk about the Peter Jackson adaptation, but I think he actually did a pretty good job on the three, and then he just butchered the Hobbit. But I mean, still, what gets lost is he's faithful to the book, but has a lot of fighting scenes, which are all in Lord of the Rings. But that's like a fraction of the book, and the rest of it is walking through the rain and trying to start a fire, and getting through the mountains, and all of that is just, again, it's a kind of an oral disposition. You'd have to sit with the characters. There's no sort of problem to be resolved. It's just being there in the woods, finding the ravine, finding the watercourse, right?
You mentioned this like partaking, this act of subcreation, like elevating nature, like you're sort of partaking in this creative act.
Yeah.
I just think about having read it as a kid and then going camping and going through particularly dark patches of timber and thinking like, that's Mercury, and it made me like walking through the woods, and it made me appreciate nature more because of his subcreation.
Absolutely. I'm completely with you on that. And I think that's why I love camping. Even when it's pouring down rain, it's an adventure, right? Those are orcs that we're fighting. But if you don't have that frame, that narrative frame, and then it's just misery and hardship, right? And this is why I take my buddies out there and they're like, why do you like doing this? But if you can sort of frame it that way. Poetry is the same. I always ask my Tolkien students to memorize a poem because we're just so bad at memorizing anything in our culture. We don't do that. And this is really new. This is an American impoverishment of our problem in our culture. I taught mostly international students one semester in my Tolkien class. I had all these transfer students. It was a really rich experience. And so I had students whose parents and grandparents were immigrants from Latin America, from different places in Africa, from Southeast Asia. And all of them would tell stories about how important poetry was to their grandparents. That they weren't academics. They were just, farmers. But they would get together and talk and read or recite poems with their friends over a beer. And then I asked if they did that, and they'd laugh. And they're like, no way, right? We're Americans. But I think having a poem in your heart will also do the same thing as a narrative. It'll shape your way you see the natural world. I'll be hiking with my father-in-law who's Irish and who speaks the Irish language. And we'll be in the bog, and we'll see a little robin land or something, and he'll spout out a little stanza about a robin. And he sees that thing radiant with beauty in a way that you wouldn't if you didn't have that poem, right?
So two questions, one quicker and one not. First is, are Tolkien's essays available via the resources we have on campus?
I haven't actually ever checked in the library. I'm sure there's a good few number of different collections of his essays, Tolkien's writings. I'm sure they're in the library. Dr. Calhoun, have you checked ever?
I know there are some that you mentioned Leaf by Nigel, and there's a volume that has Leaf by Nigel along with One Fairy Stories and 2 or 3 other essays. I think that's right. Yeah.
The 3 that I have really touched my heart are Leaf by Nigel, On Fairy Stories, and then The Monster and the Critics by Beowulf. And I'll send you those 3 PDFs if you email me.
Okay.
So.
It was the last one in particular I was interested in because I grew up with Beowulf.
Ah, wow. No way.
I read actually, or I heard it before I read The Lord of the Rings.
You heard it?
I had a brother who it's one of his favorite stories.
Wow.
He's not a classic skald, but he paraphrased
Wow.
the thing for me.
Huh.
And then the movie came out, and of course he completely lost his mind, and for good reason.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting that the critics say that, the dragon should have been replaced by a man.
Sure.
And in the movie, that's exactly what happens. The dragon is supposed to be his son, and it's been replaced by but the dragon's been replaced by his son, so it is in fact a person and a monument to his own sins, and also hypersexualization of things that should not have been hypersexualized.
Sure.
The other question is, what did animated forms. Like, I don't know what he thought on comic books. I know he hated Walt Disney, but like animated things and comic books as mediums.
Well, he really didn't like stage adaptations, right? And you can see this, even the Narnia series, Aslan it's just heartbreaking to see a CGI Aslan, right? Because these are things that can't be visualized; they can be imagined in the mind. So now we might be getting to the point where these things become possible in a way that with technology that they weren't before. But there's still a few problems. What Tolkien really wants is, he doesn't mind visual depictions, but he thought that he was just opening up a mythological world that everyone would contribute to, that people would write poems about, that they would continue to tell stories, that this wouldn't be his project, the way a traditional storytelling works, right? There were all this, people in a culture would tell the stories about Odin and about whatever. Or people would paint paintings about Middle Earth. But what he doesn't like, what he wants you to hear it is because this requires a co-creation with the author to hear. Because to hear it, you have to do the imaginative work of bringing this to life for yourself, right? And this is why I don't like it's taken me 10 years, but I finally have Leonardo, or no, whoever those, I don't know, Bloom out of my mind when I'm seeing Legolas. But it just takes so long. But you're participating with Tolkien when you hear the story, right? And that's what he wants. Remember, he hated allegory. I know some of you know this. The reason he doesn't like allegory, he said there's a couple of problems with allegory. Allegories are things like Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare. And Tolkien's point is, why waste my time putting this clear univocal proposition into some cute animal clothes? Why not just tell me slow and steady wins the race, right? There's something sort of sinister, he thinks, about allegory because it's imposing my idea onto the reader. The author's there's a kind of imperialism on behalf of the author. Whereas with a work of art, the work of art is valued for its own sake, not just for what it can do. And that requires, you can constantly go back and find new meanings in it. And it requires the creative work on the behalf of the interpreter, right? So that you are also creating with the author when you interpret a real work of art.
So, for Tolkien, humanity is sub-creators, right?
Yes.
You create from existing things, and in some cases that's physical. You take mud, you make a pot. Ideologically, there's stories about dragons and knights slaying them. So Tolkien then writes a story about stealing from a dragon, right? He takes largely existent idea and just tweaks it.
Yep.
But I wonder if there's an interesting question similar to so it'd be an ideological ship of Theseus. A story that is created now, where we could say, yes, this story is really just kind of driven from this story. But if you went and told this current story, right, you went and told Avengers Endgame, and told that story to someone who wasn't born in the past 5 centuries, would that seem like a radically new creation, right? So we've replaced and iterated so long that really it is a novel idea. And that no one in their life will see a truly novel idea, but if you took someone and exposed them to an idea far past their life,
right,
there might be something novel.
Well, Tolkien thinks the desire for novelty is itself a mistake. Have you read Gadamer?
Maybe.
Gadamer's got a great critique in Truth and Method of the cult of genius,
Okay, yes.
right? So this desire for novelty, that is not really it's not a good work of art unless it's radically new, unless it's this,
Right, I mean, that'd be Campbell's point. You're just reskinning the hero's journey.
Yeah, and that there's something important about retelling the story, because by retelling something, there's a couple layers of engaging with the pre-existing world. The first is every story is a retelling of our world, right? So even the first telling of Perseus was an experience of a ship, and then a story about the mythological ship. So, and then once someone else has told that mythical story, you're retelling that. So there's these layers of pre-existing materials that are taken up. And so you're participating in a culture, in a community, through retelling these stories. So the very desire for novelty itself is a kind of modern romantic idea that is really at odds with Tolkien's idea. I don't know if that gets at what you're saying.
Right, sure, but I guess, and I'm not necessarily saying that you need it to be novel, but it's really hard to find true novelty in your life, right? Like, I will probably never find a story that doesn't seem to echo another story I've heard.
Yes.
But could you, in theory, take someone, right, like I'm talking very theoretically here. If you told a modern story to someone, and even though some sort of omnipotent eternal being could trace the iterations of the story backwards, it would appear as novel.
Right.
And thus, since it's perceived as novel, does that make it actually novel? If there'd be a person who could perceive a story as novel, even though it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, even for them to follow it, I think would be a kind of novel act of creation from the point of view of the listener. Because just to follow a story at all is a kind of creative participation in the story. I think that's right. Tyler?
First of all, thanks for the presentation, because I am one of those people who, why would I go out in nature and get drained by mosquitoes?
Sure.
Nature's atrocious, in fact. And
yeah, you love Levinas, right?
I do. That's right. I like people.
Yes.
Oddly enough, I'm not urban, no, I'm rural, so I squared that. But anyway, and I'm also one of these people that I've never read Tolkien, and I don't like poetry, and I don't like stories, and even my children want me to read it too, and I'm like, oh god, I can't wait for the mom to come. And yet you've done a lot to persuade, right? So I'm actually happy for that. But I want, for all that, no things to this, I want to piggyback on this question. You talk about allegory. He doesn't like allegory.
Yeah.
I don't either, actually. And I found there's an issue because allegory, of course, is to understand. Like the word itself says etymologically, allos, or through another, right? And it's some debate who actually coined this term. It's probably Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but he talks about what he calls totagory, which is to say not to understand one thing by means of another thing, but an understanding that cannot be separated from the thing itself, so that the medium of the understanding and the thing to be understood can't be two distinct things, as they are in allegory. But they have to be one and the same thing, which means I can't actually strip the mythic element from the doctrinal element, as it were.
Right.
So Poseidon doesn't depict the sea, he's not representative of the sea. Poseidon is the sea, as it were. And would there be something like this here that we could use a term like totagory instead of allegory, understanding something through itself?
I think this is really, a deep question, and what immediately springs to mind is post-structuralism and people like Derrida who say all language are these debased metaphors, right? In which we've lost the similarity between the concept and the material conditions that gave rise to it. So in the end, I think that the best answer in terms of Tolkien is to say all things are akin because all things are created by the one God. So all creatures are alike, and in a sense are the same in their common filiation from the divine, right? From the divine act of creation. So no matter what I'm talking about, at the most basic level, I'm seeing something created by God, and that is the same. Now, one of the things he worries about in allegory is that the thing won't be appreciated in its own right? That I will immediately jump to try and make some kind of a moral or theological claim about and the problem with that is, doesn't it seem, it's instrumental. What can I gain from this thing, right? What can I then put to use? What outcomes am I going to get from this class? So Mr. LaBelle, here in my pedagogy workshops, they tell me, today, you're supposed to tell this before every class. These are the 3 things you're going to get today, right? So we're going to read chapter 1 of Lord of the Rings, and we're going to take this out from it and take this out. And I think that is, it's like looking at the world as a mine to be mined. And that leads to a lonely world. Tolkien wants us to take seriously these works of art as something to sit with, as something to relate to. And I do find that really plausible. So I don't want to push the kinship thing too far, such that all distinctions end up collapsing. And again, I like the word metaphor better than allegory. Metaphor, as you know, is a carrying a cross, and I like that kind of, having this thing here, but then also carrying it somewhere new.
Despite all the phantasmatic elements in the story, could we say that there's a genuine sense then in which actually he can be a literalist? Because the thing is what it is, it means what it means, it's not a stand-in for something else.
Right.
And that's in fact a kind of literalism despite the sort of fanciful nature of
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so he didn't want people to say the ring was really the Hitler and the atomic bomb, right? Although there's a lot of parallels, right? Because he wants us to take it literally as a ring of power. Yes, Tyler.
Do you think Leaf by Nickel is an allegory?
I do. Thank you for the question. I think here's a case where it's okay because it's a transparent allegory. I read Leaf by Nagel as Tolkien's depiction of himself, and I see myself in him, right? So in the end, this guy, he has the deep hunger that I've just shared with you about creation, right? So beautiful, so noble. I have that deep, deep hunger to make, to create. And then like Nagel, I get tired, I have kids I have to look after, I have to, teach my classes, there's all these things that are tearing me away from the act of creation. And Nagel, right, he's pretty mediocre, but he's really good at one thing. He actually is good at painting leaves, right? And then the inspector comes to his house and says, you haven't helped your neighbor. He's got a hole in his roof and he's gonna get pneumonia. Let's cover the hole. Nagel says, with what? The guy says, well, I see some canvas here we can use. And he says, canvas? What do you mean canvas? That's my painting. That's my life's work, right? And they take the painting and they cover the hole in the roof with this beautiful work of art. But luckily, one sympathetic government bureaucrat sees a little leaf and cuts it out, saves it, frames it, brings it to the local museum, and it's saved. 50 years later, there's a fire and the museum burns down. Right? So in the end, nothing that you create will last. And I think the tension is between this deep, deep desire to create and the recognition of our absolute futility. Most of you, the most important thing you'll create are your children, right? But your children will soon die. Right? No matter how good a parent you are, no matter how hard you try, no matter what you do, you can give them the best education, very, very soon they'll be rotting in the grave, right? And so this is the ultimate kind of reality, and there's a harsh conflict between those two themes. But I'm with Tolkien. I have a Eucatastrophic faith, which is that there will be a way in which all of this tension and futility is ultimately resolved, right? And that's for him what heaven is, right? Eternal life is not, a harpsichord on a cloud. It's that we will continue creating. Right? I mean, so many American Christians, even American Catholics, think when you die, you sort of flit off to heaven, right? Because really we're Cartesian minds that are sort of in our bodies. But in the Christian tradition, we talk about resurrection of the body. And right, there's no complete life for the human being without a body. Aquinas tries to wiggle around here. He says, well, the soul is immortal. It doesn't have any memories. It doesn't have any perceptions. It doesn't have any thoughts about anything material. And you think, well, what the hell is it thinking about? Universal, immutable. It's thinking about squares, right? Well, all right, sure. But then in order to have a complete life, there's a resurrection. So I have a deep hope and a deep confidence that my struggles will ultimately bear fruit. Right.
So in a lot of Tolkien's writings, it seems like he's kind of marrying, this, Christian theology to a certain extent with some of the old, pagan virtues and pagan stories that he appreciates and wants to, translate to people.
Yeah.
Do you think that he kind of saw those stories as sub-creations that people had developed that were worth translating into his sub-creation?
Well, absolutely. And this is a great opening to kind of talk. There's lots we could say about it. Remember this big debate among the early Christian community? What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Right? The kind of famous battle cry. Tertullian wasn't quite as extreme as that might make it sound like, but it means to say, where are we going to get our truth from? And there were early Christians that said, truth comes from Christ. The Christian truth is revealed in the scripture, and that's all we need. Burn everything else. Burn our Plato. Get rid of science, get rid of philosophy, right? And luckily, that view lost in Orthodox Christianity. But so we talk about the integration of faith and reason and the importance of balancing these two. But in this essay, Tolkien quotes, who is it? It's one of the people I really like. It's one of the early archbishops of Canterbury. I don't know if you remember who it is. He says, what is the line? What is it? What does Athens do with Jerusalem? And what has somebody to do with Christ? It's one of the old Anglo-Saxon heroes. Oh, it's in here. I'll find it for you. And that would be the idea that we don't need these old traditional, what we now call folk tales. Once you have Christianity, then you get rid of the old cultural manifestations that were pre-Christian, right? In the Christian tradition, there's great debates about this, about Pachamama in the contemporary world. Say, well, you can keep your Germanic pagan Christmas tree, right? But we're going to get rid, to become Christian means abandoning your cultural traditions. And Tolkien's very much on the view that it's not cultural imperialism to preach Christianity, but that the Christian message enlivens and enlightens and completes the pagan cultures to which it comes, right? And so you don't get rid of your Beowulf when you become a Christian. Rather, you take the old Germanic pessimism and sit with it and see Christianity as the ultimate hope that is going to give resolution to a kind of naturalist stoicism, right? And I think we could find the same in wherever you want to go. The Irish monks did the best of any place where they became Christian, but they held on to their Celtic traditions and Celtic stories, right? Cuchulainn and all those old tales weren't gotten rid of when they became Christian. Now, we didn't do nearly such a good job in North America. The Jesuits, it was one of the best parts of the story. The Jesuits learned Salish in Spokane. You can find copies of the Our Father in Salish. So but there's the same kind of idea to keep the cultural and narrative elements that pre-existed Christianity, and then they are raised up and completed with the grace that comes with the religion.
Yeah, virtually everything we know about Norse mythology was written down by a monk in Iceland.
Yeah, right. What has Ingeld to do with Christ, right? What has Athens to do with Jerusalem, and what has Ingeld to do with Christ? And there's one view, which I think is a mistaken view, that a kind of scripturalist view would say, don't tell Beowulf. Now, Tolkien thinks Beowulf was written by a Christian monk, but who existed right at the transition period. He was kind of looking back nostalgically at his pagan ancestors and was able to face into the pessimism even more clearly now that he knew about the resurrection. Right? So the Germans say life is like a beer hall in the middle of winter in northern Norway. Right? It's gorgeous and lit up. It's full of light and full of fun, full of music, but everything outside is darkness. And a swallow comes and flies in from the dark, flies in one window and flies out the other. Right? And then life is facing that tragic fact and dying heroically. So it doesn't really matter if you die in battle at 20 or die as an old man at 80. The reality is ultimate nothingness. Right? Life is a little candle in the midst of the darkness. And Tolkien thinks we should sit with that tragic view, right? And face our own finitude before hoping for grace, hoping for the resolution of that ultimate futility, right? With an unlooked for, with an unanticipatable grace. Because from within our own resources, it sure looks like I'm not getting out of this alive, right? We just don't face death at all as Americans. Our old people, we shunt off to the old folks' home, and then as soon as we quickly burn the body, hide the evidence, right? I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time in Ireland. In Ireland, I was at several wakes. The person dies, and what do? They put you in the sitting room for 3 days, and people come and drink whiskey and tell stories and sing songs and cry and laugh, and right, just facing into the ultimate futility of your life. We think as Americans. I went into a coffee shop one time, and in the bathroom there was a picture of a guy holding a surfboard. And the poster said something like, if you try hard enough, all things are possible. And I thought, what an idiotic ideology. Because no matter how hard you try, you're going to die. Right? That's the monster. That's why Beowulf's not fighting a human. If you're fighting another human soldier, you could win if you just try hard enough, or if you have better technique, or if you have a better sword, right? The Germanic pessimism is recognizing no matter how hard you try, there's no way to win. Right?
It's an interesting mention, a little bit along those lines. I haven't read the Henri's story.
Leaf by Nagel, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to have some interesting, its idea of eternity, and as the worthwhile art is the art that exists, and then it's put in the museum, and hopefully the museum doesn't burn it.
Right.
Forever for future generations, on and on and on and on. That's an interesting contrast with at least my reading of Tolkien's the emphasis he places on the here and now, and that eternity is not all it's cut out to be. The whole
Sure.
choosing to live a mortal life.
Right.
She's happy rather than with eternity with the elves and whatever other place. I just thought that was an interesting question. Is the long leaves written by Tolkien?
Yeah. Leaf by Nagel.
Speak it all to his view of the Trinity is having meaning, or only the art that exists for a long time is meaningful?
Well, there's a difference between eternity and between endless time, and Tolkien would want us to think that distinction, right? Endless time means the same, more and more and more of the same to infinity. Eternity means a radical transformation of human existence towards infinite goodness, right? And so Tolkien is meditating on this. Elves don't die, but they exist naturally forever, whereas humans die, and there's advantages and disadvantages to both ways of doing things, right? We have to face death. For us, we fly through existence. They sit with the eons of changes, right? The rise of a mountain and its slow erosion, right? They sit with nature, with being forever until the end of time, right? But for them, there's no hope. What they have is ultimately all that they're going to get. The radical hope that comes with human finitude is the hope that death provides a threshold in which a new life will be a radical transformation of human existence.
You call it the gift of man.
Yeah.
That the men don't tend to think is very good.
Well, yeah, right. When I'm thinking, this is a little bit of a side tangent, but everything I've said is a side tangent. But I think, how are we to think of the Garden of Eden in terms of evolutionary time? I mean, as Ricoeur says, it's not as if Adam existed between Picanthropicus man and Neanderthal, or So clearly, our ancestors died before us, right? And so, it's not that the original sin brought about death for the first time. But maybe one way of thinking about it is it brought the terror of death, right? Maybe a human being in the Garden of Eden would die happily, in total trust and in total confidence in God, right? Whereas for us, death has become a terror because of our alienated existence from God. That might be, I don't know, it's a little speculative, but it's one idea. Yeah, David?
Just one note in the question. The note is a nice counter to the Tertullian, what is Athens do of Jerusalem, is another comment from the church fathers picking up on the story of the Exodus that God's people despoiled the Egyptians.
Yeah.
So picking up on that story from the Exodus, as they were and they were able to take all the treasures of Egypt and take those with them. So that became an important idea for the church fathers. But the question is, going back to Tolkien clearly, as you sketched out for us in a very helpful way, as a critique of we might call it the hegemony of science in our culture. Okay, but does that mean then that should we go to the opposite extreme? I know Tolkien and Lewis often get charged with being Luddites, being anti-technology, being anti-science. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I'm a phenomenologist, which means that I don't give a priori judgments. I say if you want to judge a technology, you have to look at what parts of being it opens up and what part it closes off. I think you can't give an account beforehand. And my kind of favorite example about this is, I get accused of being a Luddite too. TV is just horrible. If you go to the movie theater, it's like, blow up your TV, move into the country, and eat a lot of peaches. Give me an account of how it affects your life, right? I think the bicycle is high tech. You can't have a bicycle without rubber, which you can't have. You need international trade with the tropics. I have a highly precision machined bike, and I could go on and on about. I have clip-in pedals, which you need computer designed in order to do, and yet it opens up being in really rich ways. I experienced the topography of the land in a way that I never would have without the bicycle. I know the prevailing directions of wind in Spokane. I watch the changing of the seasons. Actually, I commute on my bike to work. I'm riding home on it after this. So here's an example of a high-tech modern technology that I think doesn't see nature as instrumental. It doesn't see distance as just something to be crossed as quickly as possible, but rather in transporting me back and forth to work also treats the world as something to respond to in rich and beautiful ways. And so I don't think Tolkien is against technology. He's just against technologies that instrumentalize nature. Rick LaBelle has a great book on Jesuit education. Is it called The Spoils of Egypt? Is that the title of the book?
Oh, it was an essay.
That was an essay. What's the title of the book?
It's referring to the story.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
doctrine.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I would certainly take that view.
Can I actually make a reply for C.S. Lewis?
Sure.
I've been taking the C.S. Lewis class, and I think what it is that not so much technology is something bad, but technology as a god is definitely something bad. Lewis started off as a materialist, what he calls a naturalist, believing that there's only the physical world, and that's everything. There's no, God. There's no nothing exists outside of the material world. And he eventually goes through kind of not a proof, but almost something closer to a scientific theory as to why that is wrong, and also the fact that made him horribly depressed. Like, he was horribly depressed as a kid.
Well, I think I would add to what you're saying.
He understands technology and approves of it, but not as a god, not as something to be worshipped.
Sure. And I think that the basic fundamental problem is not the engineers, but is the philosophers. So we started with an instrumentalist view in the late medieval period, early modernity, certainly by the time you get to Descartes. So when you have that kind of a view, then you're going to build things that tend to treat nature as instrumental. Whereas if we have a transformed understanding, this is what Francis is saying in Laudato Si, there'll be no technological fix to the environmental crisis, only a spiritual and moral transformation. A renewed relationship with nature will teach us to treat things differently. I'm actually not opposed to genetic engineering. I think that we can open up really beautiful new ways of being, new ecosystems, new relations between animals and plants and so on. If it's done with the idea of being sub-creators, of creating something responsibly that we can love and care for, that can exist in meaningful relationships. I mean, what we're doing now is creating chickens. We want the breast, and so the animal can't walk because the breast is so large, right? This is a kind of destructive way of thinking about creation. So it really isn't the technologies, but about the instrumental view that we have in the situation, the context in which we use them.
So, like, could you make the argument that if you made a technology that was restorative or was actually in tune with like sub-creation, that would be a good thing?
Yeah. I mean, there's no non-technological human beings. Every single human culture, in fact, the genus Homo begins with stone tools. Sophisticated, bifacially flaked Acheulean hand axes have been around for 2 million years, since the beginning of our genus. So every human, in the broadest sense, and they probably had fire too, right? No human society doesn't cook their food. You just can't have human beings without technology. And the question is, are those technologies going to be creative, or are they going to be destructive? We're just learning now about how much the North American Indians transformed nature with fire, right? But in burning, they were able to keep some areas open that weren't forested, but it opened up a new creative biodiversity, a new richness of life. So here is a technique that's not hands-off. We sometimes have this idea that the environmental movement should be preserving wilderness, right? Like roping off some areas and saying, this is preserved so no human beings can go there. But we need to rethink preserving beautiful human relationships with nature. Small-scale farming, right? Small-scale timber. Humans can make nature more beautiful by being stewards and by caring for it. I think the Japanese garden is a great example, where we have a gorgeous free Japanese garden up on the South Hill. And when you go in there, it's not in your face. The human hand is sort of effaces itself. It looks as if, the idea of the Japanese bonsai is a tree on the top of a windswept mountain, right? And yet here's very, very careful human cultivation can sort of withdraw the human presence and create real great beauty.
I can't resist. One thing to wrap up with, we're almost out of time. But tell us, if you would, why do you dislike Jackson's Hobbit?
Well,
Since you
because
mentioned that.
sure, I will, and it has to do with this notion of oral storytelling. Oral storytelling often begins in media res, we say, tells things in the beginning, and then it slowly opens up the horizons of meaning. And I think this is a really beautiful technique. Whereas the modern linear notion of reality starts at the beginning, works its way to the crisis, achieves a resolution. It's a very linear notion of reality. And there's another anecdote, I'll get back to it, but you know how Tolkien, the Chronicles of Narnia were originally published starting with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I just think it's a really barbaric thing to start with The Magician's Nephew. And the publishers justify this by saying it's C.S. Lewis's wish to publish it that way. But if you look a little bit into the backstory, some 11-year-old kid wrote to Lewis and said, wouldn't it make sense to read it starting from The Magician's Nephew? And Lewis wrote back, yes, that's a good idea. Right? Not that he thought it should be published that way. And the idea is you begin in the middle with the Pevensey kids being thrown into Lucy entering the wardrobe is just a beautiful, small little way of opening up a whole magical world, right? And then from there, you slowly find out about the backstory. And that's how Lord of the Rings is designed. It's supposed to start extremely small, and then our horizons are slowly opened in this great journey, which is how we meet each other. When you get a new dorm room friend, what if your dorm mate said, hi, how are you? And I said, oh, I'm Dan Bradley. I was born in 1976, and then when I was 1, and then you just sort of told a chronological tale of your life, they would think there was something wrong with you. You get to know somebody, and then you want to know about their backstory, right? So you have to have a connection. And so the Hobbit begins with, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, right? It's the ultimate small little, the hobbits are these little creatures. They have no world historical importance. They have a beautiful little shire. And then the dwarves come, right? And they tell stories about the coming of Smaug. And in little Bilbo Baggins' heart, the desire for excitement is awakened, right? So it's because he's sitting by the fire listening to these stories, and then he wants to know more about it. And so then we slowly find out more, and then we realize this whole entire epic tale itself was a tiny, tiny little piece of the puzzle, right? That there was one thing that really mattered, and that's the finding of the ring, right? And that isn't the way he tells the story. You get Mirkwood, and you get the council of Elrond, and all these huge important beings that you just aren't supposed to meet yet, right? And what it shows us is this is what our human existence is, our life, our own little world. This is why education, I think it fits nicely with coming to college. Your horizons are slowly opened up. And then they close back down as you age, right? As the possibilities for your life become narrowed, right? And your creative potential becomes limited, right? And then that's why there's that tragic sadness. Frodo can never go back to the Shire. Right? He saved it, but it wasn't saved for him. Right?
Well, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.